Castlevania Symphony of the Night, released in 1997 for the Sony PlayStation and long since re-released on numerous platforms since then, is regarded by a great number of gamers as perhaps the greatest Castlevania game ever conceived due to its popularizing of what has been dubbed the Metroidvania playstyle. And okay, can I ask you folks something? Honest question here. Why is Metroidvania still a thing? Why are we still calling it that? It's been over 2 decades. We couldn't find some other funny genre name for this sort of style? What, is Doom clone still a thing we call first-person shooters today? Hey, you know that new Halo game on Xbox? What a great Doom clone that was. I mean, for fuck's sake. But I digress, okay. So, Symphony changed the series paradigm from its original whip-totting level-based platforming roots to a more open-ended, exploration-oriented, and exposition-heavy search, action, adventure with role-playing elements thrown in for good measure. A formula that proved successful enough for others to replicate for their own games to varying degrees of success, even though it wasn't even that new of a concept at the time. People worship the pedestal that Symphony graces, as well as the man who built said pedestal, Koji Igarashi, who would go on to helm the Castlevania series with several handheld entries based on this playstyle, pretty much making it his signature style of play that would eventually culminate in the recently released Bloodstained Ritual of the Night. So it's safe to say that Symphony of the Night is sacred ground for many longtime gamers and Castlevania fans especially, and to treat it with anything but the utmost reverence and highest of praise would be a sacrilege punishable by burning. And so that's where this asshole comes into the picture, and he's brought a fucking flame shield with him. He's also brought story time, so gather around kids, because this is going to set the tone for the rest of this review. I didn't have a PlayStation when it was new and hip. I mostly stuck with old 16-bit stuff before migrating over to the PC CD-ROM gaming on MS-DOS and Windows thing, so I never played Symphony of the Night when it was the hip thing on the market. In fact, my first foray into the new style of Vania was Circle of the Moon on Game Boy Advance, through the evil art of emulation. Visual Boy Advance, I think the emulator was called, and it chugged on the old Pentium. But whatever, it worked, and I enjoyed that game. More on that another time though. So my only exposure to Symphony was through gaming magazines, previews and such. I'll admit that at first I wasn't too enamored with what I had seen. It seemed too drastically different from the usual Vania fare, to the degree that it felt like Konami just took some random gothic themed game and slapped the Castlevania brand on it hoping it would sell more. A perception similar to one some folks may have had with the Lord of Shadow games from a decade ago. Certainly didn't help that one of my buddies at the time, who had a PlayStation, got the game, and when I asked him about it, he summed up the whole experience in 4 words that stuck with me to this day. Great game, shit Castlevania. I'm letting that sink in so some people can have their conniption fits now if they haven't done so already. And it's not a line that I associate with Symphony nowadays, but it did color my initial impressions of the game, and I hadn't even played it yet. Eventually, I did get myself a PS1 system around 2000-2001, the redesigned PlayStation that was a lot smaller, and I still have that to this very day actually. And one of the games I was able to get my hands on was Symphony of the Night, because it was one of the many games re-released under the Greatest Hits label where they sold it for much cheaper. And it starts off in a familiar Castlevania setting, assuming control of Richter Belmont, the hero of the last Demon Castle outing, the final stage of Rondo of Blood, complete with hidden stairway that actually reveals itself here. And this is basically a recreation of the final battle as it played out in that game, except whenever Richter dies, Maria comes in to heal him so he could continue the fight. At first glance, this seems like a nice little bone to throw at the wider audience who couldn't play the original Rondo of Blood, and playing around with Richter and his expanded moveset, he now has a slide, he can run, do the whip waggle, and a couple other moves he didn't have in Rondo, which Would have been nice to have, but that's okay. That's kind of cool. But there is an ulterior motive to this battle, as your performance here determines your starting stats for the main event, as it were. Anyway, I'd walk over to the main room, endure some cringy, terrible vocal performances that have since become cheese and meme-worthy, and played the Dracula final battle that ended with the screen melting. And after a prologue of scrolling text, the main game begins, and actually, you know what? Let's just dive into it and we'll pick up the story as needed. Castlevania Symphony of the Night places you in the role of the half-vampire son of Dracula, Alucard, who has once again awakened from his slumber to defeat the evil machinations of the Count and his evil servant Shaft. Now in Castlevania lore, Alucard's last appearance was in Castlevania 3 Dracula's Curse, where his only weapons were some long-range but largely ineffectual fireballs, as well as the ability to turn into a bat. Symphony, thankfully, gives Alucard something more reliable to fight with. You start with a sword, but along the way, you can find a whole host of weapons, whether they be swords, knives, staves, flails, axes, and other bits and bobs. You also have a number of sub-weapons hidden in certain candles you could knock off, from the usual fare of daggers and axes to less common fare like rebound stones and books. That's somewhat Castlevania-ish, right? For the most part, your objective is to build up your abilities to traverse more of the castle and defeat the evil dude who is running things. Said abilities include various transformation powers into bats and stuff, as well as double jumping and other bits and bobs. Along the way, you'll come across other characters where the music will pause and more bad voice bites are dropped to give you some exposition and lore, which includes the mystery of Richter Belmont now calling himself the master of the castle or something. I guess I could think of worse places to make a home. Also scattered throughout the castle are save rooms to save your progress, warp rooms to warp you to different parts of the castle, some dude running a shop in a library and stuff, and some oddball settings where you could sit down and stuff and more stuff like that. Lots of stuff in this symphony of stuff. Symphony adopts a more RPG mentality to its gameplay. The weapons, armors, and accessories you amass range from straightforward fare to those possessing unique properties, further increasing their worth, whether it be protection against certain elements or special executions. In addition to equipment, there are also consumable items, foods, potions, and the like. These are somewhat cumbersome to handle since you don't pick an item to use it. Instead, you equip it to your other free hand, toss it to the ground, and then you pick it up to consume it. I don't know why they did it like this here, but in later Igavanias on the GBA and DS, ditched this in favor of just picking the item on the menu and it gets used. That works better, I think, than whatever the fuck this is. However, one thing that does work is the open-endedness of Symphony. I don't want to call it non-linear because there is a set path that the game wants you to take, especially at first where most paths are generally out of reach. Gaining new abilities to move around as well as key items to open certain doors opens up more of the castle, allowing you to reach and explore places you couldn't before. There might have been a room that was out of reach that you could now get to and possibly find something of use. Certain walls can be broken, revealing hidden rooms and treasures. It's the main lore of this style of search action gameplay. Symphony does have a bit of a grind though, particularly in regards to leveling up, but also in regards to accumulating items and such. So if you're wanting a particular drop, you're going to be spending a lot of time doing the grind. The grind is something that's been a hit and miss affair with a lot of these Igavania entries, Igavania being a term coined by the Bloodstained marketing, but one I adopted to refer to Igarashi's Vania and Bloodstained output, and only his output. And Circle of the Moon, because why not? But yeah, some items are easy finds, others are rare drops among rare drops, and some can be purchased from the library. So you spend a bit of time building up strength, your arsenal, and your stats that eventually lead you to the Castle Keep, where you'll partake in a final battle with the Lord of the Demon Castle, who turns out to be a Belmont gone bad, our old buddy Richter. If you defeat him straight on, the game ends and nobody knows why Richter went bad.
It's over, Belmont. I had the high ground. You see, even I am a better voice actor than this Alucard gay. If only he would stop ripping off my games.
With special glasses equipped, you'll discover that the Belmont was controlled by an old ally of Dracula named Shaft, the same Shaft you defeated in Rondo of Blood. So how do we follow up this new development? Well, we venture into a second castle. That's just like the first castle, except flipped upside down. which sounds neat. Another castle to explore, more gameplay. Except this is where Symphony starts to lose me. This second half where everything is flipped upside down, which not only makes navigating these things a hassle even with all your transformation and moves, but within these inverted halls lie new monsters, more powerful evil beings to contend with, and again, I should be excited because there's more game to play, but it just feels like padding for the sake of padding. Like they ran out of ideas to flesh out the game more, so they just flip the castle and have fun. It takes a bit of looking before you realize that you have to look for the 5 body parts of Vlad to unlock the final chamber with Shaft and eventually the Count himself. Hey, say what you will about Simon's Quest and their lying lies, but at least that game gave you some indication as to what you're supposed to do. Go to the mansion, get the body part from this here mansion, and repeat 4 more times with other mansions and parts, because that's one of the few things you could actually figure out on your own with that game. Symphony doesn't even give you that much. All you get is Shaft's gonna revive the Draculas in the middle. Yeah, bro, I'll finish this, don't worry. Yes, the much maligned Simon's Quest did a much better job of explaining shit than the cult-worshipped Symphony of the Night. What the fuck, man? So once I get the body parts, I get to the final battle, beat Shaft, beat Dracula, listen to some more bad voice acting, and then a terrible song plays during the credits. Then I found out you could actually play as Richter Belmont in a separate mode that has no story exposition, but you have free reign on where to go. Richter in this mode is more versatile and agile than his Dracula X outing. All of them. He can slide, he has an uppercut and dash move to reach higher places, he could run, his old item crashes and backflip move still works, and Richter mode is unbalanced as fuck, and not in a good way. Most of the castle is open for you to travel to, but some areas are off limits because they require items you can't get. You can collect money bags, but they mean nothing. You could bounce the old man in the library, but he won't talk. Life containers will supposedly increase your max HP, but your only indication is seeing how quickly or slowly your meter refills whenever you pick one up, and despite the new abilities, some of which require some ridiculous motions to pull off, and control isn't quite on the mark here as it would be in the main game, Richter simply feels ill-equipped to tackle these challenges properly, and the more I play Richter mode, the more this whole thing comes across as a complete afterthought thrown together at the last second without much care. It's a neat idea on paper, but feels like something that was tacked on to try and appease those who prefer gameplay along the lines of the franchise's origins, hence the somewhat loose nature of the mode, or perhaps more cynically, something that was tossed on there to justify the Castlevania name on the game, which was probably the thought process behind my friend's perception of Symphony being a great game but a shit Castlevania. Now, I never really subscribed to that notion even back in the day, but it did make me ponder a question that wouldn't come up again with this series until Order of Ecclesia or the first Lords of Shadow game. And that is, if you took away the Castlevania name, some of the recycled assets and lore, made it its own thing and called it something else like, say, I don't know, Bloodstained for example, would it still have been as successful or held in high regard, and would anyone have cared? I've seen series diverge from its path before, and I've been fine with those, but not here, and really, that was the crux of my first Symphony of the Night experience. It was a finely crafted game that I enjoyed, and surely one of the great pinnacles of the genre, but it was also a game that I didn't feel strongly about, and honestly only bothered with because of the franchise it was tied to. A franchise that I enjoyed in its early days, that showed signs of evolving beyond its humble 8-bit origins that were also tossed aside for something more generic in nature. And if Symphony wasn't part of that series, who knows if I would have bothered with it in the first place. What made this feeling worse was that I played Circle of the Moon before getting around to Symphony, which was a similar style of game, but the main hero of that game had a whip as his main weapon, and I could easily identify that as a Castlevania game. This prologue at the beginning feels like a mean-spirited Trojan horse to lull you into a false sense of familiarity, only to slap you aside to this other thing that feels like you could have called it anything else. In hindsight, I kinda wish they hadn't included this and just went straight into the main game. Maybe then I would have been one of those numbers worshipping this game on a pedestal in the Church of Igarashi. Eventually, as time went on, and I sampled more Igavanias on the GBA and Nintendo DS, my stance on Symphony would change for the better. Still think it's a great game, and I'm more accepting of it as part of the Castlevania lineage, but as far as being the pinnacle or the bestest of the series done in this style or in general, I'd imagine it's in that spot by default since it's the only console release in that style that isn't a half-hearted, shallow multiplayer thing. But in a gameplay sense, there are some aspects of Symphony that are, quite frankly, rather sloppy. The way Symphony handles item usage, being unable to offload or sell off excessive wares to the shopkeeper, only gems, which I always thought was stupid, the lack of music during cinematics being an odd choice and serving only to emphasize the silly performances, a few instances of slowdown that occur during certain moments, including whenever you defeat a boss and a magical jar appears in a spectacular visual effect, or rather would have been if not hampered by slowdown. All sorts of nagging little issues and quirks that would pop up, some unavoidable due to technical bits like the occasional load times between segments or the aforementioned slowdowns that would occur, while others are just questionable period. But does it really hurt the overall package that is Symphony of the Night? No, because despite some nagging bits here and there, the Gore gameplay is pretty solid. The inventory might be a bit bloated, but experimenting with different weapons and their different properties and actions are pretty fun. Discovering the move commands for your various special powers like the classic teleport and fireball launch. Discovering new foes to fight like the various bosses, or how many times they'll recycle that same skeleton sprite set to create different types of skeletons and such. And the control's pretty solid and responsive. As long as you have some of those bits working and working great, that's the important part. And that's something Symphony does right. The one thing I could praise in regards to Symphony is that the visual presentation holds up exceptionally well. The video bits are, well, they are what they are. But the rest of the game is absolutely splendid looking. The hollow halls of the Demon Castle look exquisite and foreboding. Alucard himself is a rather dashing fellow, and I like the flow of his cloak as he moves about. The monster designs are pretty neat, whether it be the smallest critters or the most monolithic of undead titans. The little movements of the characters in the cutscenes as they're talking is quite cute. And while I poke fun of the game's recycling of older stock, at the very least that stuff blends in nicely with the rest of the game. Oftentimes games will recycle assets from other games, and the end result is off-putting, but not here. There's a number of recycled Rondo sprites here and there, but there's also a couple Castlevania 4 bosses brought in wholesale, and they also mesh in nicely with the rest of the game. Symphony is the first game in the series to feature the character designs of one Ayami Kojima, who would provide further art for subsequent Castlevania entries. All I will say is that she has very nice portraits, but sometimes her male characters come across somewhat effeminate unless they were old or had some sort of facial hair, although this would later be de-emphasized in her later works. I do find it funny that Richter Belmont has this new regal look, but the game still uses his old Rondo sprites, which is amazing. The audio portion of Symphony of the Night. Well, I'm probably in the minority, but let's get the obvious out of the way. The voice acting is one of the hallmarks of the game and is beloved by the masses, but personally, I cringe every time the gameplay is interrupted by an in-game cinematic where the music suddenly stops and people start talking. The voice acting itself, it's not the best, and I probably attribute that to poor direction than anything, since voice acting in video games of this era have been uneven, shall we say. I remember thinking the vocals were the worst part of the game, and honestly, I'd like to think that as time went on, my stance somewhat softened. I mean, they're still not very good, they're not quite the cheese that almost everyone else makes it out to be, but they're not the game-killing experience I used to think they were. I'm also a bit mixed on the soundtrack, and this is more personal taste than anything. But there's a mix of orchestral rock pieces and orchestral ambiance, and the rock bits tend to have the same problem I have with the Rondo tracks. They sound like tunes taken from a studio album and slapped into a video game, although unlike in Rondo, the tracks do loop properly. My favorite tracks seem to be the more orchestral, slower pieces. Stuff like Lost Painting, Wood-Carved Partita, and Tower of Mist seem to be the ones that resonate the most and add to the experience more so than it does to detract. On the flip side, the one song that plays during the majority of the Inverted Castle, the final toccata, a fine piece when you only have to listen to it once, but for every other moment in every other room in every other segment in that fucking second castle, it wears out its welcome very quickly. Sound effects comprise stock sounds, quick voice bites, grunts, that sort of thing, and everything has an echoey effect to it, almost as though the sound design was done in a cardboard box or something, so that's just me though. Of the 900 plus reviews that I've done so far, and of the many games that I've played over an obscenely confounding course of almost 35 years, Symphony of the Night is, without hyperbole, the one game I find myself struggling with over how I feel about it. The easy thing would have been to do a simple fluff piece, go with the general consensus, and declare this the greatest Vania ever, like most people have, and call it a day. The very least, this video would have been half as long, if I had gone that route. But a video like that would also ring false with me, and I try to be honest with my feelings on these things, even if they do go against the general consensus. Castlevania started off with a guy using a whip to kill vampires and monsters, and that was appealing to a kid like me for whatever reason. I just dug the idea. Subsequent games added to the formula with new characters and new gameplay mechanics, but never deviated from that core idea that made it somewhat unique. Then Symphony comes along, tosses most of that aside, and opts for something that copies Super Metroid's format, traded blasters for swords and sorcery with a gothic twist to it, and sprinkled some RPG elements to sweeten the deal a bit. And hey, credit where it's due, that game was a success, and deservedly so, because it's a superb game with a fair bit of replayability and possibilities, but I'd never go so far as to call it an evolution of Castlevania, but rather more of a divergent sidestep or detour that turned out to be a good call at the time, while Konami's main efforts in trying to bring Castlevania to the third dimension did not yield as much regard. It was diverging from the gameplay that drew me to the series in the first place and turning into something more generic and interchangeable in nature instead of building on what came before. Honestly, taking the best elements of the 16-bit games, the whip mechanics of Castlevania 4, the multiple characters of Bloodlines and Rondo, along with the latter's branching paths, and putting them together into one package with further enhancements would have made for a truly exceptional Castlevania adventure. Maybe that was my main beef with Symphony, souring on the game for what it wasn't rather than what it was. I have not touched Symphony of the Night in a very long time. Out of all the 2D Castlevania games, it's probably the one that I've played the least. And I think I've logged in more hours playing Symphony in the past couple of months for the purposes of this video, which has also been lingering for a very long time, than I have in the past 2 decades since I first got my PS1. And you know what? I'm not quite ready to put Symphony on its pedestal of worship like many of you may have. I'm not quite ready to call it the greatest Castlevania ever. Hell, I wouldn't even call it the best of the Igavania offerings. I think it's a split between the Sorrow games and Bloodstained. Most of all, I still would not call this an evolution of the Castlevania franchise. Not by a long shot. But I would call it a vital addition to the lore. Symphony provided the template for subsequent series in the series to follow, build upon, and refine. Entries that I've played countless times and enjoyed tremendously over the ensuing decades. It provided a formula for numerous copycat titles to take inspiration from, for better or worse, and it also gave one creator a signature style of gameplay to hang his hat on. Those are the things that earned Symphony some of my regard as one of the highlights on this long-running Castlevania saga. But at the core of it all, however, Symphony of the Night is simply a finely crafted adventure game that has its share of highlights, hiccups, and anything else in between. There was clearly some care put into this, and while it may have started off as a side project of sorts, it ended up being one of the best games to grace the original PlayStation, and a game that is well worth going out of your way to play. Whether it's the PS1 original or the PSP version via the Dracula X Chronicles, or even that Requiem re-release thing on the current PlayStations or something. Castlevania Symphony of the Night is a classic for a reason, and it is a game that holds its own more than 25 years after its initial inception. Oh yeah, you could transform into a bat, a wolf, or a pile of mist when you have the appropriate relics, and further relics will enhance those forms even further. But you already know that because a few clips of those forms in action played during the video, so I didn't really need to mention it. Circle's up next tomorrow, kids. Later.